Hello, and welcome to United for Peace, Episode 1.3, The War on Mercenaries. Last time, we discussed the constitutional crisis which overtook the Congo not long after it gained its formal independence, and how subsequent events led the UN Security Council to pass Security Council Resolution 161. I've already gone over the provisions of Security Council Resolution 161, but let's reiterate one of the provisions, because it will have important consequences for ONUC's operating orders. ONUC headquarters issued Operational Directive No. 10, which directed peacekeepers to interpose themselves as quickly as possible between warring parties, even if the parties were actively engaged. This was all but certain to actively involve the UN in the internal conflict one way or another. The new resolution represents a dramatic shift in ONUC's purpose. It was originally to simply protect people and property while helping the government to restore order. Now the goal is effectively for ONUC to take the initiative to facilitate a political arrangement in the Congo which would preserve order on its own. It even authorized the use of force for reasons beyond self-defense. That didn't give ONUC an extremely broad authorization to use force, but it did establish a new realm of operational possibilities. Do you see mission creep poking its ugly little head up? Ironically, with the death of Lumumba, it became easier to implement a political peace between most of the factions loyal to the concept of a Congo Republic. The UN still recognized Kasavubu as the legitimate head of state, and Mobutu's political control was effectively confined to Leopoldville itself, and able to be contained. So, now that Lumumba was no longer around, despite the array of politicians with Lumumbist proclivities, Kasavubu and Mobutu felt secure enough to go along with UN suggestions to enter into negotiations with Antoine Gizenga to reconcile. Painstaking negotiations took place through spring and summer, eventually leading to the reconvening of Parliament on July 22, 1961, and an apparent reconciliation between Gizenga and Kasavubu. But, like I said, the negotiations were painstaking, and events on the ground were even more painful during this time. Remember that massacre at Port Franqui? That happened 2 weeks after a tentative agreement was reached to reconvene Parliament in 1961. The new Parliament would not accomplish much in the way of smoothing over the crisis, which continued to be characterized by strong men acting on their own accord. Things were looking at least slightly up by August 1961, though, as UN representatives on mission had facilitated agreements between Mobutu, Gizenga, and Kalonji. Kazai was reintegrated into the Congo, Gizenga's forces stood down, and Parliament reconvened. Cyril Adoula formed a government as Prime Minister, with Gizenga as Deputy Prime Minister. Gizenga never actually took up his post, however, so you know it was a rather shaky government. Significantly, this was achieved through diplomacy rather than force. However, Katanga did not reintegrate at this time. Instead, backed by foreign financiers, Tshombe hired foreign mercenaries to defend Katanga from national forces. As the Security Council had called for the expulsion of all foreign mercenaries, UN forces were deployed to such an end, and armed clashes were common throughout late 1961. Now, ONUC was not simply going to force the mercenaries out of Katanga right away. They wanted Katanga to expel them on its own initiative, but Tshombe interpreted Resolution 161 and ONUC's operating orders drawn from said resolution as means for UN forces to, quote, provoke incidents, end quote. And so he made arrangements to harass ONUC in ways specifically calculated to encourage withdrawal. He incited and inflamed anti-UN demonstrations, intimidated them with gendarmerie patrols, and ordered business owners not to serve UN personnel. One time, when the UN provoked an incident, according to Tshombe's framing, was on April 7th in Kabalo. Ethiopian peacekeepers had been sent to the city to separate warring factions in accordance with SC Resolution 161. Here, the factions were Katangese gendarmes and armed balubas. Despite the presence of UN peacekeepers, the Katangese forces decided to assault the city. a Katangese barge opened up machine gun and mortar fire on the city, while 30 mercenaries attempted an aerial assault, landing an aircraft at Caballo Airfield. However, all 30 of these were quickly captured by the peacekeepers. At this point, the peacekeepers decided to investigate the incident by the river, but the patrol was ambushed. 3 soldiers were wounded, and a 4th got separated from the unit. He had not returned by the next day, so the entire Ethiopian unit in the city returned to the site of the ambush the next day to search for the missing soldier. But they were fired upon again. They returned fire and ended up sinking the barge in the Lualaba River. And just for reference, this is not a small river. On a normal day, without recent rains, it is still the width of a couple decent blocks, and it's a tributary of the Congo River, which, if you weren't aware, is the deepest recorded river in the world, about 720 feet or 220 meters at its deepest. By August, ONUC forces would be taking the initiative directly against Katangese forces. So, how did they get to that point? Remember those 30 mercenaries captured at Caballo? Well, during interrogations, they revealed that mercenary recruiting stations had been set up in Rhodesia and Johannesburg, South Africa, both of which were directed by Belgians, and that recruitment took place in Belgium itself. Astoundingly, one of these mercenaries had his contract on his person when he was captured. It revealed a lot about the wealth disparity between Katanga and the rest of the Congo. Mercenaries in Katanga's employ were paid generous salaries, housing and food allowances, family indemnities, hazard pay, life and disability insurance, and survivor's benefits. All the while, ANC soldiers regularly went unpaid, which is also something you can't say about the Katangese gendarmes. The UN tried to reach a peaceful resolution with Katanga, both for the expulsion of mercenaries and reintegration into the Congo, but this mercenary problem made it practically impossible. Diplomatically, the UN convinced Tshombe to attend a series of 3 conferences, at the second of which, the Tananarive Conference, he agreed to reintegrate Katanga into a confederated Congo and ostensibly supported the recall of parliament. But that was back in March, and clearly Katanga was not moving towards compliance with this agreement. As we have seen, Katanga only got more aggressive against the UN and did not extend any olive branches to the Congo central government. After all, we are talking about Moise Tshombe here. He just wanted his corporate mining state. So, after trying to persuade Katangese officials to pursue their agreements and to de-escalate armed tensions, and failing, ONUC established a new command in Katanga on August 5th, headquartered in Elisabethville. Indian Brigadier K.A.S. Raja would be force commander, and Connor Cruz O'Brien would act as chief of mission as Hammarskjöld's special representative in Katanga. And they resolved to drive the mercenaries out of Katanga and see if maybe then the rebellious province would be more inclined to accept diplomacy. I should note here I mentioned Connor Cruz O'Brien as chief of mission. Chief of mission in Katanga Command. There was still Andrew Cordier as chief of mission at Leopoldville headquarters. Got that? Good. Parliament had already reconvened in July without Katange's participation. The Congo formed a new government under Cyril Adula on August 1st. Tshombe did not recognize this government, so on August 24th, President Kasavubu issued Ordinance No. 70. This ordinance declared that all non-Congolese officers and mercenaries not under contract with the central government of the Congo were illegal aliens. He also explicitly requested UN assistance to enforce the ordinance, so the UN now had domestic legal authority to act in accordance with Security Council Resolution 161. ONUC directly clashed with Katangese armed forces on August 28th when they launched Operation Rump Punch, which started 24 hours earlier than scheduled in order to maintain tactical surprise. ONUC Katanga Command only had about 4,000 troops at its disposal compared to the 7,000 men under Katanga's command. I know I said 10,000 earlier, but the numbers wavered back and forth and there are various estimates, so at this time it seemed like 7,000. Just roll with it. Anyway, despite this disparity, they figured that gendarmerie morale was so low that they would be completely ineffective without mercenary leadership. Contrary to military common sense, ONUC did inform Shombe that they were launching this operation, laid out their objectives, and let him know they would use Irish and Swedish forces to apprehend mercenaries, who were all white. This is why starting the operation early was important. It's not like Katanga had a crack intelligence agency that had intercepted UN plans. This, however, obviously raised suspicions and doubt among Katangi's leaders, especially as ONUC forces seized the Elisabethville radio station and post office. These were not objectives laid out in the mission originally. Mr. O'Brien and Brigadier Raja decided to occupy these buildings without informing the Secretary General. They believed that these would be used to broadcast inflammatory propaganda against the UN and to coordinate hostile actions, which, as evidence will later reveal, they were right. Oh yeah, they also momentarily detained Katanga's interior minister, who they believed would have directed actions against ONUC forces, which he probably would have. But still, the aim of the operation was not to destroy the Katangese gendarmerie or subdue the secessionist government, but merely to detain and deport mercenaries within the Katangese armed forces. By 3 p.m. on August 28th, 79 European mercenaries and officers, including Belgian officers of the former Force Publique, who were still officially commissioned by the Belgian army, mind you, were arrested at the cost of one ONUC soldier wounded by friendly fire. It was dark, okay? Following this noteworthy success, Shombe ostensibly acquiesced to ONUC's demands to discharge and expel all foreign mercenaries. The French and Belgian consuls in Elisabethville requested a meeting with Brigadier Raja to discuss the fate of those arrested. Again making their own decisions without informing the Secretary General, Raja and O'Brien agreed to a plan for the Belgian consul to arrange for repatriating the mercenaries and officers. But then this consul turned around and said that he only had authority to repatriate officers commissioned by the Belgian army. Even then, all he did was threaten to strip officers of their commission if they did not return to Belgium. I've already told you how lucrative Katangese mercenary contracts were, so you can imagine this was not a big deal to at least some of the men. Secretary General Advisor General Riquier lamented this as a serious lost opportunity to, quote, close the ring and remove all the unwanted individuals, end quote. Now, although the operation was fairly successful and restored a good deal of confidence in the UN from African and Asian states, it did not reach all military centers in Katanga, and so many mercenaries and officers escaped capture and even set up a headquarters to wage guerrilla warfare against UN forces. Of the 442 known foreign mercenaries and officers in Katanga, 338 had been captured before and during the mission, but 104 remained missing. In addition to this, after Operation Rumpunch, Katanga set up roadblocks to prevent UN forces from carrying out their mission. They also intensified harassment of Baluba people with the intent of driving them to UN camps for refuge. So, although Moise Tshombe up to this point nominally cooperated with ONUC to reach a deal regarding the expulsion of foreign mercenaries and advisors, it was obvious that Katanga no longer seriously considered cooperating with the UN. Anticipating trouble, ONUC headquarters dispatched a battalion of Gurkha Indians to reinforce Katanga command. A series of fast-paced diplomatic activity took place trying to convince Tshombe to come to terms with the Congo government, but to no avail. It seemed only coercion would bring him to heel. So O'Brien sent an ultimatum to Tshombe. The ultimatum demanded the immediate surrender of all mercenaries and foreign nationals serving the gendarmerie, and to go to Leopoldville within 24 hours. Otherwise, ONUC would launch another military action. Tshombe did not give in, and so ONUC Katanga Command committed itself to action. On September 13th, once again acting without informing the Secretary General, Raja launched Operation Morthor, an 8-day operation that established nominal control over Katanga. He had approval from Mr. O'Brien, either explicitly or tacitly, and the express approval of Mahmoud Kiari, the ONUC Chief of Civilian Operations. UN forces took control of government buildings in the Katangese capital of Elisabethville, including the radio station, where Raja's forces massacred 30 civilians who had run into the building. General Raja's forces suspected and worried that those who rushed inside would take up arms and resist, since Operation Rumpunch had seen non-uniformed combatants attempt to resist UN forces regularly. So, without confirming the presence of arms or armed combatants, grenades were thrown into the building, killing the 30 civilians. Connor Cruz O'Brien covered up the massacre, although rumors of it reached Shombe, who immediately broke off all negotiations with the UN. Mr. O'Brien also proclaimed the Katanga secession was over on the 13th. Talk about jumping the gun. I mean, ONUC was not really prepared to subdue the entire province in the first place. They were so short on food and ammunition, ONUC forces only opened fire to repel infantry assaults on the positions they took up. Now, it bears mentioning, ONUC did not really make the first move here. Gendarmerie leaders noticed that ONUC forces were obviously preparing for another large offensive operation, so Katanga took steps to shore up their position. They reinforced roadblocks and got the Belgian consul to initiate a sneaky ploy for them. On August 3rd, the Irish company garrisoned in Jadotville to protect the large population of Belgians there moved out to the town's outskirts at the request of the Belgian consul, apparently because of an elevated risk in a particular area. On August 9th, with nothing out of the ordinary having happened, Katangese gendarmes, led by Belgian and French mercenaries, surrounded the company and laid siege to their positions. The company commander recommended immediate use of force to break the siege, but sensitive, high-level negotiations were taking place at that time, that fast-paced diplomacy I mentioned before. Because of this, headquarters told them not to use force, especially since they had not yet come under fire. At this time, Dag Hammarskjöld personally flew out to Rhodesia to facilitate negotiations directly between Shombe and the new Congolese Prime Minister Cyril Adula. He condemned O'Brien's decision to launch this offensive at such a sensitive time, especially without notifying him, and for crossing the, quote, fine legal line, end quote, between peacekeeping and enforcement. O'Brien insisted that it was up to Mr. Chiari to notify Carl Linner, chief of mission at this time, who would then be the one to notify New York. Nonetheless, Hammarskjöld thought it important to come out himself to try to salvage the diplomatic situation between the Congo, the UN, and Katanga. But Hammarskjöld never made it. His plane crashed on September 17th, killing him and everyone else on board. He was heading to Ndola to meet with Mr. Shombe, who had agreed in principle to meet for direct negotiations, but never responded when Hammarskjöld rejected terms for a ceasefire, including such a provision as, quote, UN troops to be confined to their camps, end quote, because of course the UN isn't going to leave all of its forces sitting ducks. Now, there really wasn't any radar in the Congo at this time, so we are not certain if another aircraft was present in the airspace at this time, nor do we have any ground intelligence at the time which would determine if any surface-to-air weapons were used. However, it is still widely believed that Katangese forces shot down Hammarskjöld's airplane, and evidence published in 2011 by Susan Williams, a historian whose work mostly focuses on African affairs, suggests that a Katangese gendarmerie aircraft was responsible. Setting aside the mysterious downing of the Secretary General's plane, what's important to know now is that despite capturing government buildings in Katanga's capital, the UN did not subdue the secession movement as Connor O'Brien had claimed, nor had they dealt a decisive blow to the mercenary presence in Katanga. No deal had been reached with Mr. Shombe nor his government. As I just said, Secretary General Hammarskjöld was traveling to meet with Shombe when his plane was shot down. Now, despite Hammarskjöld's condemnation of O'Brien for approving Morthor, he recognized that the mercenary issue made Katanga's continued independence unbearable, or at least a major obstacle. One of Hammarskjöld's last official orders was for the deployment of fighter and light bomber aircraft for ONUC's use to help bring Katanga to heel. Sweden sent a squadron of Saab J-29s, Ethiopia 4 American-made F-86F Sabres, and India sent 6 British-made Canberra interdictors. So, why were the mercenaries such a big deal? Why were the mercenaries themselves enough to convince the UN that Katanga's independence was so bad? Well, fighting in Morthor revealed the alarming extent to which foreign support propped up the secessionist state. British, French, and Belgian consulates provided encouragement, if not direct aid, to the gendarmes. Rhodesia, meanwhile, provided a secure area for mercenaries to withdraw to and regroup. Clearly, without the aid of foreign mercenaries and imported weapons, Katanga's government could not sustain itself, while Tshombe would have no incentive to negotiate and end the conflict so long as he had this sort of support. Oh, I forgot to mention, the gendarmerie's morale, as noted before, was so low that they practically did not fight when they weren't led by mercenaries. Moving on, it was especially clear at this point that native Congolese people did not want to fight the UN for the most part, as I kind of just hinted at. The Irish company at Jadotville surrendered on September 17th at their outpost in the proximity of Jadotville, but they probably would not have if not for the fact that mortar fire destroyed their only means of radio communication. The 2 companies sent to relieve them met with a stroke of luck on September 16th, the day just before the besieged unit surrendered. The African soldiers maintaining the roadblocks around Jadotville started ignoring their foreign officers' orders. This made the roadblock untenable, and so the gendarmerie units of the city and the UN personnel made a deal whereby the mercenary jet which had attacked the besieged Irishmen and the UN base at Kamina would be grounded, and UN gendarmerie personnel plus local authorities would conduct a joint tour of the city and its surroundings. The Congolese soldiers of this gendarmerie unit even provided the UN soldiers with fresh food and other comforts, indicating, if anything, how happy they were that they were there. Similarly, the officer in charge of the mission reported on September 17th that practically all fighting had ceased with actual Congolese soldiers, and that only white mercenaries continued attacking UN forces. Even in Elisabethville, African soldiers of the gendarmerie regularly fraternized with UN personnel, and that's in spite of the earlier mentioned order not to do so. Although a mortar attack the previous day had already struck the UN civilian headquarters in Elisabethville, causing several casualties. Additionally, the mercenary jet was clearly not grounded, as it attacked the traffic control tower at Kamina Air Base on the 17th. This is hardly surprising given that it was almost certainly a white Rhodesian pilot operating from an airbase run by white mercenaries. It's entirely consistent with what we observe around this time. However, that was it for September 17th. On September 18th, the British Embassy delivered a message for Mr. Tshombe to the mission headquarters in Leopoldville. In it, Tshombe claimed that he ordered a ceasefire before leaving Elisabethville, which the UN, not his men, immediately broke. In any case, he also said that he had still been waiting for Hammarskjöld to arrive in Ndola so that they could put, quote, a complete stop to the state of affairs, end quote. Although the mission responded that this was not possible in light of reports of the Secretary General's death, by the evening they decided to send the Chief of ONUC Civilian Operations, Mr. Chiari, to Ndola to negotiate. He and 4 staffers would leave the following morning. Although there was a little more gunfire in Elisabethville, the day was pretty quiet. There were no more attacks made, and that pesky jet we've been talking about was nowhere to be seen. Now, although September 19th started out pretty nasty, most of the day was quiet. Shots from the ground had been fired at UN planes taking off from Kamina Air Base, and automatic mortar fire was opened up on UN positions near the civilian hospital at Albertville. However, the UN battalion around Albertville quickly counterattacked, decimating the enemy positions. They seized a 37mm gun, and to quote the officer in charge's report, several foreign nationals in civilian dress who had been seen manning and directing the fire of this gun. So there's another war crime for anyone out there keeping score. The important news from this day is that, despite Tshombe originally saying that he would not negotiate with Mr. Chiari, on whom he blamed much blame for the pains of Katanga, the two agreed on a ceasefire after a lot of negotiation. Now, a lot of people think that politicians are a bunch of do-nothings, but let me tell you a bit about these negotiations. After Mr. Chiari reached Ndola, he and Chombe negotiated for 4 hours straight before breaking for lunch. The time of this lunch is not recorded, but we know that they finally reached a ceasefire agreement at 15:45 hours, sometime after returning. Imagine spending a good 7+ hours with one short break spent doing nothing but essentially arguing with someone who hates you until you've finally come to a very, very important agreement. It may not be manual labor, but it is certainly not leisurely work. And bear in mind, Mr. Chiari flew to Ndola to do this even after the last person who attempted to do so was shot down and killed. Not to mention, Chombe had already declared once that he would not negotiate with Mr. Chiari, making it even more probable that this would be his final flight. I can easily imagine the stress taking a few months or so off his life. Anyway, the ceasefire agreement was received by the UN mission headquarters at 1700 hours. Internet would certainly have been a useful thing at this time. The ceasefire was set to take effect at midnight, September 21st. September 20th was reported by the commander-in-charge as, quote, quieter than usual, end quote. The infamous jet had not been seen for another day in a row, and no shooting of any kind was reported from Elisabethville, Jadoville, or Kamina Air Base. On September 21st, the ceasefire order required by the Ndola Agreement went out. There were 2 shooting incidents, sniping at the UN refugee camp for Balubas, and a few bursts of machine gun fire towards the Elisabethville post office. But that was it. Besides that, Katanga was calm, and thus ended Operation Morthor. Official terms for the ceasefire were agreed upon on October 13th, while UN personnel engaged in routine parts of their mandate, protecting lives and property, trying to restore law and order, and so on. This involved the civilian legal experts and jurors being brought into the country to help provincial, local, and national courts functioning, persecuting crimes, and defending the accused as well. Now, Katanga violated several terms of the ceasefire, but not anything so drastic as opening fire on UN personnel. One violation worth noting is that the terms of the ceasefire included Katanga expelling all foreign mercenaries and advisors, yet a quote-unquote Belgian consulate in Elisabethville housed 12 officers of the Belgian Regular Army. Straight up Belgian officers. When asked what they were doing there by UN personnel, gendarmerie officers gave them the straightforward truth. They were providing general staff and technical advisory assistance to the gendarmerie. I mean, they didn't even try to hide it at all. What's more, some of these officers were known individuals who had directed combat against ONUC forces previously. Along with this, many mercenaries turned up during this time who had already been deported from the Congo before. If you are wondering at this point why ONUC didn't immediately call out Katanga's repeated violations of the ceasefire and put them to the wall, there are 2 big reasons, but we will have to save those for next time. Thank you for listening. I hope you will join me next time on United for Peace, as Katanga once again breaks its promises and ONUC puts them to the wall.